The American Story, The Beginnings, by David Barton and Tim Barton, as read by Karl Hirsch. The American Story highlights some of the interesting moments and people that reveal God's providence in America. We have a fascinating history that must be remembered and passed on to future generations. Section 3, The American War for Independence. Chapter 1, The Hand of Providence. Chapter 2, Early Tensions, 1765. And Chapter 3, The Boston Massacre, 1770. The Hand of Providence. The evidence of God's hand seen so often in our earliest years is also apparent during the establishment of America as an independent nation. George Washington affirmed that, quote, "The liberties of America are the object of divine protection," end quote. During the war, he had strong words for those who refused to acknowledge this self-evident truth, telling General Thomas Nelson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, that, quote, "The hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith, and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. But it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases," end quote. In Washington's view, if someone had seen the miraculous divine interventions in the war and did not feel compelled to acknowledge and thank God for what they saw, then that person was truly callous and wicked. And Washington admitted that he had personally witnessed so many of these interventions that he could have turned preacher after the war ended. The immediate chain of events that led to the War for Independence started more than a decade before the Declaration of Independence was penned. In 1765, the British Parliament, that is, its legislature, imposed a Stamp Act upon the colonists. This required that published materials such as newspapers and legal documents be printed only on paper embossed with a royal stamp, indicating that a tax had been paid on those materials. The colonists were not opposed to paying taxes, for they paid many taxes enacted by their own colonial legislatures, but they were adamantly opposed to paying taxes when they had no voice in the decision. Because the Americans had no representatives elected by them serving in the British Parliament, in their view, the Stamp Act was a violation of their fundamental rights as citizens. Many Americans spoke out against the unjust Stamp Act, including ministers such as the Reverend George Whitefield and the Reverend Charles Chauncey, and political leaders like James Otis, Samuel Adams, and Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, the state legislature, shortly after the passage of the Stamp Act tax. He was new in the state assembly, but when he found none of the senior legislative members willing to oppose the tax publicly, he felt compelled to take action. He therefore penned resolutions against the Stamp Act and introduced them in the legislature. Because several members were staunchly pro-British and supported whatever the British did, Henry reported, quote, "Upon offering them, the resolutions, to the House, violent debates ensued, many threats were uttered, and much abuse cast on me," end quote. At one point in those discussions, Henry brought up what he felt were applicable lessons from the past. He started with ancient Roman history, pointing out that when Caesar, the Roman emperor, usurped power, Brutus rose up from within his own government and killed him for the good of the country. Henry then reminded them that England's own history, when King Charles I similarly seized arbitrary power, Oliver Cromwell had arisen and had Charles executed for the good of the country. He then brought his lesson home to the current British ruler, King George III, by declaring, quote, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III, but before he could finish, the shout of "Treason! Treason!" erupted from across the room. They believed he was calling for the murder of King George III. But without any hesitation, Henry finished his sentence with, quote, "May profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it," end quote. He nimbly turned the debate in an unexpected direction and refused to back down. Henry reported that his speech had a significant impact in rallying the patriots in the Virginia legislature. This is what he said. After a long and warm contest, the resolutions against the Stamp Act passed by a very small majority. The alarm spread throughout America with astonishing quickness, and the ministerial party, that's the pro-British, were overwhelmed. The great point of resistance to the British taxation was universally established in the colonies. This brought on the war, which finally separated the two countries and gave independence to ours. Whether this will prove a blessing or a curse will depend upon the use our people make of the blessing which a gracious God hath bestowed on us. If they are wise, they will be great and happy. If they are of contrary character, they will be miserable. Righteousness alone can exalt them as a nation. Proverbs 14:34. Reader, whoever thou art, remember this, and in thy sphere practice virtue thyself, and encourage it in others. Patrick's passionate speech turned the tide. One early historian reported that Henry was, quote, hailed as the leader raised up by Providence for the occasion, end quote, and further explained, America was filled with Mr. Henry's fame, and he was recognized on both sides of the Atlantic as the man who rang the alarm bell which had aroused the continent. His wonderful powers of oratory engaged the attention and excited the admiration of men, and the more so as they were not considered the result of laborious training, but as the direct gift of heaven. Of Henry's speech, Thomas Jefferson reported, quote, I attended the debate and heard the splendid display of Mr. Henry's talents as a popular orator. They were great indeed, such as I have never heard from any other man, end quote. Recall that Henry learned much of his remarkable oratory skills at the feet of the Reverend Samuel Davies. Because of Henry's efforts, in conjunction with those of patriots in other states, the British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. When unofficial word of that decision reached America, many pastors preached sermons in celebration. Then, when the official word finally arrived, the Massachusetts legislature called a statewide day of prayer and thanksgiving to Almighty God. On that day, the Reverend Charles Chauncey, a Massachusetts pastor who had openly opposed the Stamp Act, delivered a famous sermon commemorating the glorious event, as did many other ministers. 50 years later, John Adams looked back and identified both Chauncey and that sermon as a catalyst in the early movement leading to independence. Although the repeal of the Stamp Act took place in 1766, the British did not want the Americans to believe they were free from British control. They subsequently passed the Declaratory Act, affirming that Britain had the authority to make laws binding colonists in all cases whatsoever. To many patriots, the idea of such unlimited power was the very definition of tyranny. Britain then passed the Townshend Act, Acts 1767, which placed additional taxes on common items the colonists imported from Britain. But from the Americans' viewpoint, they were still wrong, for they again passed these taxes without any American consent or representation. One of the patriots who led the opposition to these new measures was John Dickinson, who later became a member of the First Continental Congress and went on to sign the Constitution. He wrote essays criticizing the Townshend Acts and argued that Americans should be in charge of their own internal and domestic affairs. His writings were widely distributed throughout the 13 colonies and helped inspire the growth of resistance. Dickinson became known as the penman of the Revolution. Samuel Adams authored the official response of the Massachusetts legislature, calling the acts a violation of the, quote, natural and constitutional rights, end quote, of Americans. That document urged a return to the principle of local control of taxation and called for the other states to boycott the newly taxed goods. British officials ordered Massachusetts to retract its response, but by a 92-17 vote, the legislature rejected that demand. Crown-appointed Governor Francis Bernard then dissolved the legislature, resulting in widespread protests from citizens. The British sent several regiments of soldiers to Boston, believing this show of force would quell tensions, but it had the opposite effect. In March of 1770, a British soldier on patrol along Boston's King Street heard a young American insult a British officer. In response, the soldier smacked him on the head with his musket. When the boy cried out in pain, citizens rushed to investigate. Tempers mounted, insults were exchanged. The growing crowd began to throw rocks at the soldier, daring him to shoot them. When word of the altercation reached British Captain Thomas Preston, he dispatched several soldiers who ran toward the crowd with fixed bayonets. They formed a defensive line and barked orders at the assembly. One of the frustrated crowd members, tired of the oppressive British behavior, was Crispus Attucks. Few records exist about his birth or early life, but it is believed that he was an escaped slave who became a sailor. He likely had a shared Native American and African American ancestry, but today Attucks is celebrated as a black patriot who firmly opposed British tyranny. The crowd, then several hundred, continued to yell at the soldiers, and many began throwing snowballs and rocks. Some even approached the soldiers with clubs. One soldier, struck by a thrown stick, angrily fired into the crowd. Other soldiers, fearful for their safety, joined him and fired a volley. 3 colonists were killed instantly, with 8 others wounded, 2 of whom died shortly thereafter. Crispus Attucks was one who died during the volley, and his blood was regarded as the first spilled in the cause of liberty. Paul Revere produced an engraving of this event, which became known as the, quote, Boston Massacre, end quote. And other images featuring Attucks appeared across the decades. The British soldiers were arrested and accused of murder. Prominent attorney John Adams defended them, and even though he was an ardent patriot, his integrity and zeal for justice and the law remained uncompromised. He honorably and ably represented the soldiers, 6 of whom were acquitted. 2 soldiers received reduced charges from murder to manslaughter, for they lacked initial intent to kill and were primarily responding in fear for their lives. This deadly event seemed to cement the course of the coming conflict. The relationship between the Americans and the British continued to deteriorate. John Adams, speaking of the Boston Massacre, later acknowledged, quote, "Not the Battle of Lexington or Bunker Hill, not the surrender of Boulogne or Cornwallis were more important events in American history than the Battle of King Street on March 5th, 1770, end quote.